Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Tanks with the mighty Jingles. It's been a couple of weeks since I did a tank review for you, and so that's what you're getting today. It's the long-awaited review of the Jagdpanther 2 German Tier 8 tank destroyer, one of many German Tier 8 tank destroyers, although for a long time there was only one German tank destroyer on the block, and that of course was the mighty Ferdinand. Now, I have had the Ferdinand for a very long time. I think this was my first Tier 8 tank destroyer of any nation. I've played 273 games in this machine, and I love it to bits. Of course, there is also an even newer Tier 8 German tank destroyer in the market, the Rheinmetall Borsig Waffenträger. And what we've got here with the three German Tier 8 TDs is three very, very different machines. With the Ferdinand, it's all about the armour and a very, very powerful gun. With the Rheinmetall Borsig, it's all about the stealth and a very, very powerful gun. With the Jagdpanther 2, it's all about the mobility and a very, very powerful gun. And to some degree, also the armour as well, but in a completely different way to the Ferdinand. So, let's have a look at the stats and see what we can find out about this machine right here. None of the Tier 8 tank destroyers have a particularly large amount of hit points. The Jagdpanther 2 has 1150. The ISU 152, for example, the Russian Tier 8 tank destroyer, has 1050. The Rheinmetall Borsig, 1100. The Ferdinand, 1200. Ferdinand always did tend to have more health than the other Tier 8 TDs, but health is always an issue for Tier 8 tank destroyers of any nation. None of them have the ability to soak up a particularly large amount of damage, and that's what used to make the Ferdinand so attractive. Not just the fact that it had 1200 hit points, but also the fact that it's got 200mm of hull armour at the front. Now, the Jagdpanther 2 definitely does not have 200mm of hull armour at the front, and it has less health than the Ferdinand. But more on that later. As far as weight goes, well, it's not the lightest of the three. That would go to the Rheinmetall Borsig, which weighs barely over 20 tons. The Ferdinand is a 67, potentially almost a 69-ton machine. The Jagdpanther 2, 53.75, anything up to 56 tons of weight. But it's got a 700 horsepower engine, whereas the Rheinmetall Borsig has this pathetically weedy 207 horsepower engine, and the Ferdinand, while it does have an 840 horsepower engine, has a lot more weight to shift. So the Jagdpanther 2 is undeniably the most mobile of all three of these machines. It can do 55 kilometers per hour. It turns at 38 degrees per second. It's definitely got the whole mobility thing going compared to the other two, and as it should, it's based on the chassis of the Panther tank. We're going to flash up Tank Inspector to have a closer look at the armour of the Jagdpanther 2, but for now we'll have a look at the rest of the stats and the guns. 380 metre view range, which is pretty good. Not as good as the 400 metres on the Rheinmetall Borsig, but better than the 370 metres on the Ferdinand, and all three of them have very, very similar radios. In fact, the Ferdinand and the Jagdpanther 2 both share the same radios, 710 metre signal range versus the 700 metre signal range radio on the Rheinmetall Borsig, but nobody really cares about 10 metres difference in signal ranges on the radios. Now, when it comes to the gun selection, the Jagdpanther 2 and the Ferdinand both have exactly the same guns. However, they are tank destroyer versions of guns that you are already going to see on the German heavy and medium tanks. So, unfortunately, if you think, oh, I've already unlocked the Pak 43, for example, on the Tiger, well, yeah, unfortunately that's the heavy tank version of this gun. Same deal here with a 105mm, which is to all intents and purposes exactly the same gun that you get on the Tiger 2. You're going to have to research them all anyway, unless, for example, you've already unlocked all these guns on the Ferdinand, in which case, bingo, you've got them on the Jagdpanther 2 as well. But unless you've gone down the tank destroyer line, you're not going to have these guns unlocked. Now, leaving aside the 128mm gun for the moment. In fact, we'll shut the stats down so we don't get confused. These are the two guns that you're going to be using first on the Jagdpanther 2 and on the Ferdinand. Same gun selection. You've got the 88mm Pak 43 and the 105mm Pak L52. And a lot of people will continue to use the 88 rather than switch to the 105. And they'll keep grinding out the XP they need for the 128mm gun using the 88. The 88 has a much better rate of fire than the 105, 10 rounds per minute versus 7.5. It actually has better penetration than the 105, 203 versus 200. Obviously the damage isn't as much. The alpha damage up front is only 240 versus the 320 of the 105, but the 88 is again more accurate with 0.32 accuracy versus the 0.34 of the 105. The 105 does have a better aiming time though, 1.7 seconds, which is very, very good, and is actually a significant factor on the Jagdpanther 2 because of the gun traverse. But more on that later. However, the 2.3 second aiming time of the 88 is not bad either. But the main reason why people tend to use the 88, aside from the fact that it's more accurate and has slightly better penetration and a better rate of fire, is the fact that the ammunition is dirt cheap compared to the 105mm ammunition. In fact, I will show you exactly. We'll buy both of the guns. There's the 105. And there's the 88. And observe the ammunition costs. 252 credits per shot for armor-piercing ammunition for the 88. If you mount the 105, 1,030 credits per shot. It costs almost 5 times as much, well, 4 times as much, to fire the 105mm gun than the 88. And the 88's real-world performance is pretty much the same as the 105. It's more accurate, it's got better penetration, it just doesn't have as much alpha damage. And that's why a lot of people continue to use the 88mm gun rather than upgrade to the 105 when they're grinding out the XP they need for this beast here, the 128mm gun. And this is a very, very nice gun. The rate of fire is not good. 5.13 rounds per minute, but it has 246mm of penetration with standard ammunition, 490 alpha damage. The accuracy does suffer a little, 0.35, but the aiming time's not bad, 2.3 seconds. This is a really, really nice gun, and the Ferdinand has exactly the same gun selection. Let me just quickly, because I would really hate now that I've just fitted that gun again, to take this thing into my next game without any ammunition loaded. That would be embarrassing. The Rheinmetall Borsig obviously has a different gun selection, although to all intents and purposes it has the same 128mm gun. The stats are exactly the same, except for in one category it has a slightly better rate of fire, 5.5 as opposed to 5.13 rounds per minute. Other than that, the stats are identical. Well, the gun weighs a little more, but the barrel's twice the size, so that does sort of make sense. Surprisingly, despite that extra long barrel, you would expect the shot to have higher velocity and therefore higher penetration. It doesn't, game balance. So yeah, the Jagdpanther 2. Now, and again, this is one of those things that you really can't tell in the garage. You can tell in Tank Inspector, and we'll show you in Tank Inspector, but one of the things that the Jagdpanther 2 suffers from is poor gun traverse. And we mentioned this slightly earlier. And when I say gun traverse, we're talking about without moving the hull of the vehicle, how far you can move the gun to the left and the right to get it pointed at a target. It's pretty bad on the Jagdpanther 2. And that's one of the things on the Jagdpanther 2 that makes the 105mm gun slightly more attractive than the 88. And that's because of the aiming time. And those of us who have driven French tank destroyers using the top guns on French tank destroyers will be only too aware of the frustration of using guns that have long aiming times with narrow gun traverse. The 105 does aim significantly faster than the 88, although the 88's 2.3 seconds is still not bad at all, but that is something to bear in mind on the Jagdpanther 2 because of the poor gun traverse. The Ferdinand does not have poor gun traverse. The Rheinmetall Borsig has got a turret, so it only really applies to the Jagdpanther 2. And to illustrate that example even further, as well as have a look at the armour, we're going to flash this thing up in Tank Inspector. Now, as far as the armour situation goes, it's a kind of a good news, bad news deal. The Jagdpanther 2, like the Panther that it's based on, has atrociously bad side and rear armour. At the rear on the hatch, it's only 35mm thick, the rest of the rear is 40. The sides are only 60mm thick. The tracks and this armour panel on the side do count as spaced armour, but that's only 16mm thick, with 60mm of armour behind it, and the tracks count as 25mm of spaced armour. From the front, it's a different story. Now, the biggest target area on the front is, of course, the upper glacis, and this was the same for the Panther. Now, in World War II, until the 90mm American guns with high-velocity armour-piercing ammunition were introduced, at most combat ranges there wasn't a Western tank or even a Russian tank on the battlefield who could penetrate the glacis of the Panther II from the front. It's only 100mm thick, it's 100mm thick, but it's also sloped back at 50 degrees, which gives it an equivalent of around 150mm of effective thickness. The lower glacis is not good, 60mm, sloped at around 55 degrees. But it's the upper casement, the fighting compartment frontal armour. You never ever want to be shooting at the front of a Jagdpanther 2 anywhere near the gun, because this armour is 150mm thick, and look at the slope, look at that angle. Just to give you some sort of idea of the kind of mountain that you're facing when you're trying to shoot at the front of this thing, we'll close the range to 100 metres, or as close as. That shot right there is looking at 232mm equivalent of armour, and that's the easiest place to penetrate the upper hull at the front of the Jagdpanther 2. If you do have to shoot at the front of a Jagdpanther 2, as with most German tanks, aim at the lower glacis. If you have to shoot at the upper glacis, aim for the machine gun hatch. It's an armour weak spot, it's only 60mm thick. Don't, under any circumstances, aim your shots at the front of the upper casement, because you're just wasting ammunition. Unless, of course, you're driving something tier 10 with ridiculous amounts of penetration, but even then, be really, really careful. Because of the sloping, your shot is likely to just bounce, even before it gets to calculate whether or not it's penetrated the effective thickness. And just to confirm the numbers about the gun, if you have a look in closer detail, we'll see the gun elevation is 15 degrees. The gun depression, 6.5 degrees, which, yeah, it's bad, but it's not really bad. It could definitely be worse, but I think that's actually quite generous for a machine that has the gun mounted so far to the rear of the vehicle. The horizontal traverse of the gun, yeah, 20 degrees of arc. That is pretty terrible. It's almost like driving a French tank destroyer. And to compare it to the Ferdinand, for example, which is what everybody always compares the Jagdpanther 2 to, significantly worse than on the Ferdinand. The Ferdinand gets 30 degrees of firing arc, which is pretty damn nice. Right, it's time to get our game face on. First replay is me and Quickie Baby, and we're both in our Jagdpanther 2 in a tier 8 game here on the new version of the Redshine map. It's an encounter battle, so the flag is in the saddle of 2 of the 3 hills in the centre of the map. Straight away, I decide I'm going to head over here to get some long range shots. Anybody cresting the ridge on the far side of the 3rd hill, and also, with a bit of luck and some careful positioning, to get some effective fire into anybody who moves into the cap. And this is where the mobility of the Jagdpanther 2 comes in. Getting into this position safely long before anybody is in a position to spot me moving over here. You couldn't do this in a Ferdinand. Well, you could, but the chances are you'd probably get spotted before you made it. There we go, somebody's already up there in the cap. But I managed to get up here before whoever that was in a position to spot me. That's where that 55 km/h top speed comes in. Now, this game is pretty much perfect Jagdpanther 2 material. Throughout this entire game, I never get spotted by the enemy team. Hell, this would be perfect Rheinmetall Balsig material. But this is the way you should always be trying to play the Jagdpanther 2. With the Ferdinand, you can sometimes use it as an assault gun. It does have a lot of thick armour at the front. Not that you can't do that in the Jagdpanther 2, but it is a lot more risky. And Quickie Baby is in fact doing that over on the other side of the map. He's playing in a completely different way to me. He's over there with the light tanks and the medium tanks, playing very aggressively and taking the fight to the enemy. You couldn't do that in a Rheinmetall Balsig or a Ferdinand. They're just not fast enough. At the same time, he's not being completely reckless about it. He is letting the lights and the mediums go ahead of him, and he's shooting up the targets that they spot for him. And, you know, he has the speed to do that. Myself, on the other hand, I'm over here with the heavy tanks, so I have to be a lot more circumspect about it. And my first kill is a pretty cheap shot at a harmless, inoffensive little tier 4 820, but hey, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't be playing tier 4 light tanks. So, you know, there's not a lot happened over on this side. I've got a couple of heavies in front of me. I figure, screw it, I'll move up. And that's when, oh, there it is, KV5. And it does look like this is where the enemy heavy tanks are starting to push through. So, I want to keep these two friendly heavies, actually these three friendly heavies, between me and these. Now there's two enemy heavy tanks coming down this road that we know of. So I'm backing up, back to my original position. So my job right now is to keep those three heavy tanks alive by staying undetected and putting withering and effective fire into everything that comes down that road that thinks they're big and bad enough to take a pop at my heavy tanks. Because these are my heavy tanks. And if you want to kill them, you're going to have to talk to me first. Now, this situation could not be better for me. I have a minimum of 3 layers of concealment between myself, that KV5, and all of his little friends. Because I've got all this concealment in front of me, they're not even going to spot my position when I fire the gun. No idea where that shot went, by the way. But, yeah, plenty more where that one came from. In order to get to me, they've got to get through 3 heavy tanks. And our 3 heavies they've got a lot of good solid cover around them. So while these guys are all faffing around, worrying about the 3 heavy tanks that they can see, the Jagdpanther 2 that they can't see is taking them apart piece by piece. The situation is an absolute dream for a tank destroyer driver. And this is how you do big damage in World of Tanks. You keep the gun firing. And that's exactly what's happening here. Those 3 heavy tanks have actually done very little other than be there. And I'm not knocking them for it. Right now, being there is the single most important thing that they can do for me. They're just taking damage. And it's a very mercenary way of looking at it. But they're going to survive, and they're going to win because they were there to take the hits, while these enemy tanks drove up this choke point one at a time in front of my 128mm gun. If those 3 heavy tanks hadn't been there, I wouldn't have been able to do this. And while it is a shame that you don't get XP and credits in World of Tanks for taking damage, those 3 heavies aren't going to go away. Well, one of them died. I failed in my mission to keep them all alive. But they're not going to go away empty-handed, because I didn't do any of my own spotting there. Those guys are going to get a metric shit ton of spotting damage because all of the damage that I did in that game was as a direct result of those guys being in that position. But anyway, there's the result of that game. Second class mastery badge with 2,732 experience earned. Brothers in arms, myself and Quickie Baby, both got 4 kills. The high caliber badge for the most damage done, and the tank sniper badge as well. Now, remember I kept singing the praises of the heavy tanks who were in front of me in that game. And I want to draw your attention to something here. Now, I by far did the most damage in that game. There it is. 4,363 damage done. From 13 shots fired, 12 hits and 11 penetrations. Damage upon detecting? Nothing. Not 1 point. I didn't detect a single target myself in that game. I didn't blow anybody's tracks off. Everything that I did in that game was direct damage. Now, of the 3 heavies who were up front, there's one of them, the IS-3. He got 808 spotting damage, so that's 808 damage that I did to targets that he detected. We also had a Tiger. Where's he? There he is. He got 774 spotting damage, damage that I did to targets that he had detected. But there was also a Tiger 2 up there. Now, my base experience in that game was 911. There's the Tiger 2. His base experience was more than mine, 930. He did 1,600, almost 1,700 of his own damage, but because he was the one right up in front, there it is, right there. All of that, 2,683 spotting damage, is damage that I did to targets that he was lighting up for me. So Private Henk, if you're watching this video, cheers dude, could not have done that without you. Thank you very much. So you've just watched me doing really well in the perfect Jagdpanther 2 position. I mean, you could stick any tank destroyer with a big enough gun in the position that I put myself in the previous game and watch them clock up a lot of damage. This one is going to be different. This is Sven Rudebrody, and I'm not pronouncing that again because I'll just get it wrong. So we're just going to call him Sven for the remainder of this video. He's in his Jagdpanther 2. It's another tier 8 game. Different circumstances, however. Now, while I do recognise that circumstances can differ wildly in the games that you end up playing in World of Tanks, I do recommend that as a general rule of thumb, subject to circumstances on the battlefield, you always try at first to play your tank destroyer cautiously. And that doesn't mean camping at the back. You know, by all means, use the speed if you're in a fast tank destroyer like a T-49 or a Hellcat, or even a Jagdpanther 2. Use the speed to get forward early into a good ambush position. And I must stress the use of the word ambush position. You're in a tank destroyer, not a heavy tank. All too often you see people, particularly in T-49s and Hellcats, they're notorious for it. They get their hands on a fast machine and they just use it to get themselves killed first. It's a complete waste of the capabilities of the machines that they're driving. Try not to waste your health. Sven here is playing the traditional tank destroyer role right at the start of the game. He's staying well back, pretty much as I did in the previous example, and he's using the tanks in front of him to light up targets for him so he can put his 128mm gun to work. Now, you don't have to do this every time you play a tank destroyer. It does work reasonably well, but if you do have a faster tank destroyer and you want to use that speed, by all means, use it to rush forward, but don't just rush forward blindly. Have a plan. Decide where you're going to go before you go there. Look for those ambush positions, and if you've got a machine that's fast enough to get there, by all means use it. But the second you get spotted, get the hell out of there. Use your health wisely. If you are in a fast machine that doesn't have a massive amount of armor, your health pool and your stealth are the only things that are going to keep you alive. And you should be using the stealth first, not the health pool. Expending your health should always be a last resort. Now you'll notice that in this game we have an AMX 5100 on the team, who's the only person on the team who's headed east to go around the peninsula and try to outflank the enemy team. He knows he's the only person on the team who is headed out in that direction because he's done nothing but complain about it since the start of the match, and yet he is still sitting out there in front of a Tiger, a Tiger II and a KV-1S. And this is something else that you see in World of Tanks over and over and over. He recognised that the position that he was in was terrible because he's done nothing but complain about it, and he has in fact just died. But if, recognising that continuing the attack down that flank was pointless, instead of sitting there and complaining about it, he'd turned his arse around and fallen back, as the T-28 prototype behind him was begging him to do, he would still be alive. He would have a T-28 prototype to rely on to keep him covered anytime he had to fall back and reload his magazine, and between the two of them, they'd stand a good chance of being able to repel the attack from those 3 enemy heavies. But instead he didn't. He sat out there in a completely exposed position and just complained the whole time, and all it did was get him killed. And now Swen has to go back and help this T-28 prototype defend against the attack from these 3 heavy tanks. Now, I have been doing this for a while, and I know how this works, and I know that many of you have already paused the video and are busy typing in the comments that Swen should have gone back to defend long before now. Well, that's where you're wrong, sunshine. Swen wasn't just tunnel visioning on the tanks that were in front of him, he was paying attention to the map, and he has picked exactly the right moment to come around. The T-28 prototype there does have artillery support. And there's the KV-1S, and there's the Tiger II. And Swen's spider sensors are tingling. Somebody is gonna be trying to sneak around. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner. Show him what he's won. So they've exchanged the first shot, and Swen immediately uses the speed of the Jagdpanther II to get in close to the Tiger. He cannot allow the Tiger to shoot at his lower glacis, so he gets so close the Tiger can't hit his lower glacis and can only ineffectually bounce shots off that upper hull, which is practically bulletproof to a Tiger's gun at that range thanks to the sloping. So that's the Tiger. The KV-1S has been dealt with. Swen wants that Tiger too. It's a much, much more juicy target, and he should, now that he's gone around and dealt with a Tiger, be in a position to come around behind him. Yep, there he is. All too easy. It's worth pointing out that none of that is anything that the AMX 5100 couldn't also have done if he'd been just prepared to actually do something about the situation he found himself in, rather than just sit there complaining about it. Meanwhile, Swen's had his moment of excitement going face to face against the Tiger, and he's once again back into exactly the position you want to be in, well, any tank, but particularly in a tank destroyer. He's got a Tiger II up front, who is spotting these targets for him. Swen is undetected, and he's able to fire with impunity. He's killed a T-150. Not particularly challenging when you're firing this 128mm gun, I admit. But now here comes the mobility of the Jagdpanther II. Now that there aren't 3 heavy tanks driving this way, now would be a good time to exploit this open flank and get around behind the enemy team. Speaking of the enemy team, T-28 prototype. He needs to die. Very tough from the front, not so much from the side. Now, he did clutch his first shot, but he didn't know he was going to get another opportunity to fire as the T-28 prototype drove through a tiny little gap, just like that one. T-28 prototype's side armour is even worse than the Jagdpanther II's. It's 50mm at the most. And by a stroke of luck, the T-28 prototype is so incredibly slow that by the time it reached the next gap, Swen's gun had reloaded, which was nice. Now, KV-5 platoon, who look like they're going to kill that T-29, an IS and an M12 artillery. Here's one for you, fact fans. The M12 155mm howitzer wasn't actually used much as artillery by American armoured divisions in the Second World War. What they would instead use it for, yep, there goes the T-29, would be to drive it up under cover of darkness to within a couple of 100 metres of German fortifications on the Siegfried Line. And then as soon as the sun came up, blast the bejesus out of them at practically point-blank range as a direct fire assault gun rather than artillery. You're welcome, by the way. I read a lot of books. And there he is. And there he goes. You can actually watch Second World War newsreels of M12 howitzers being rolled into, I think it was Patton's Third Army's attack on the town of Metz. They literally rolled artillery. Oh, there's the IS. We'll just take a sneaky shot at him. Lovely jubbly. There we go. Is he going to stay there? It'd be nice if he did. No, he's pulled back. Okay, never mind. But yes, Patton's Third Army routinely used M12 artillery in the direct fire role in point-blank range in the city of Metz to just blast German defenders out of their positions. Surprisingly effective, or perhaps unsurprisingly effective. Anyway, oh, did you see that? The IS and the artillery just both killed each other. Completely missed that while I was blathering on about the M12. So, alright, well, things just got slightly more interesting. Those two KV-5s were last spotted up in the far northwest corner of the map. And they are in a platoon, so they're likely to be travelling together. Now, the T-28 prototype looks like he's digging in on the far side of the cap and just waiting for them to come in and try to start capping. And that's not a bad idea, because the KV-5 has 167 millimeters of penetration, unless they're firing APCR ammunition. And the front of a T-28 prototype is more than capable of handling that kind of battering. So he's in a decent position. And he's in such a slow machine that staying on the defensive in the cap is probably the best use of his resources. Swen, on the other hand, is not in a slow machine. Now, the last known position of those two KV-5s was when they killed the T-29 all up in the northwestern side of the map, but that was quite some time ago now, and they could be absolutely anywhere. The last enemy vehicle that they will have spotted would have been Swen when he was back in their base, killing off their artillery. So they may have come back down to their base to defend their cap, thinking that Swen was going to try and sit in the cap circle. Obviously he hasn't done that. And initially I thought he was coming back down here to back up the T-28 prototype and defend the base, but that may indeed have been exactly what he was originally planning to do, but now it looks like he's got other ideas. Instead, it looks like he's quartering the map, trying to actively find the KV-5s. There's one of them. Alright, this should be fun. There's one. He backs off in case he got spotted, but his sixth sense doesn't go off. Now the KV-5 does have pretty poor view range. So he pops up again, guns reloaded. KV-5 looks like he is stuck. And falls off the bridge and dies. Now, Swen did get spotted there, but it's always wise not to jump to conclusions. The tank that he was shooting at is not necessarily the one that spotted him. Those two KV-5s are platooned, and just because Swen didn't see the other KV-5 does not mean that the other KV-5 is not in cover, closer to him, and is the one who spotted him. But the fact that he hasn't been lit up again, and that nobody is shooting at him, does indicate that the KV-5 who just died is in fact the one who spotted him there. But that begs the question, where the hell's the other one? These two guys are platooned, don't forget. They're likely to be travelling together. But there's no sign of the other one. And the clock is ticking down. So, if there's one enemy tank left, there's not much time left on the clock, and you need to find out where he is, or win. Go and sit in the cap circle. He's either going to come to you, in which case you get the chance to kill him, or he's not going to come to you and you're going to win by capping. It's better than a draw. But the KV5 driver sees a third option. He suicides. There he is. He was on 10% health and he just drove off into the ocean. So, sorry Sven. Yeah, you're just going to have to settle for 3000 XP, Ace Tanker, High Caliber, Top Gun, and Confederate, and the Tank Sniper badge. So, yeah, I know it's a tough life, but somebody has to do it. 8,389 damage done, 1,675 base experience. It's not bad whichever way you look at it. 23 shots, 21 hits, 21 penetrations. He even got some spotting damage. God knows how. He must have tracked somebody. 382 spotting damage. He damaged 12 of the enemy tanks and killed 6 of them. That's a really, really nice game. In your Jagdpanther 2. Well played. And I was so impressed with his performance that to compensate him for the severe emotional trauma he suffered by not getting a Radley Walters into the bargain, as those 2 KV5s killed themselves right at the end, that I sent him 2,500 gold as some sort of compensation for the emotional trauma that he suffered as a result of playing that game. So, if you were to ask me which was my favourite German Tier 8 tank destroyer, I genuinely wouldn't be able to say. I mean, I have a soft spot for the Ferdinand, but that's purely because I've played 273 games in it. Each machine has its own strength, and the strength of the Jagdpanther 2 is by far its superb mobility. I do think all 3 are great machines, but the one thing that I will say about the Jagdpanther 2, notwithstanding anything that you've seen in any of the replays I've shown you today, is that it is not that great a machine at carrying a game in the way that you can in the Ferdinand or the Rheinmetall Borsig. And I'm talking about the kind of situation where your back's up against the wall, you're the last one left alive on your team, and you've got 4 enemy tanks still to deal with. The Rheinmetall Borsig on the right map is stealthy enough to be able to still kill all 4 remaining enemy tanks without being detected. The Ferdinand has the armour to back itself up into a corner and just take the hits and kill the 4 remaining enemy tanks. The Jagdpanther 2 doesn't have enough armour and it doesn't have enough stealth, and the mobility is good, but running away from enemy tanks doesn't win games, or it doesn't carry games. The Jagdpanther 2, on the other hand, is able, because of the mobility, to ensure that that situation never arises in the first place. And that, to me, is the strength of the Jagdpanther 2. It is fast enough to be able to react to threats developing on the map in a way that a Ferdinand or a Rheinmetall Borsig never could. So while the Ferdinand and the Rheinmetall Borsig may end up carrying games against all the odds when they're the last tank left alive on their team, in a way that the Jagdpanther 2 couldn't, if you're in a Jagdpanther 2 and you know what you're doing, you can ensure that that situation never occurs in the first place, in a way that you just can't really do in the Ferdinand or the Rheinmetall Borsig, because they're just not fast enough. Ah, but Jingles, you say? I've got a game where I was alone against 6 enemy tanks, and they were all tier 10s in my Jagdpanther 2, and I killed all of them, and yeah. Anything's possible. It's just not very likely. I've got a replay where a guy does over 2,000 damage in a Marder 38T, tier 4 German tank destroyer, in a tier 8 match. And yes, I will be showing you that one pretty soon. But that doesn't mean I'm going to suddenly start recommending everybody drives Marder 38Ts in tier 8 matches. The only thing that proves is that even a broken clock can tell the right time twice a day, and that anything is possible when you're playing World of Tanks. Nevertheless, do yourself a favour. Try to use the mobility of this machine to identify those threats early on and respond to them in a way that only the Jagdpanther 2 can. And I think you'll have a lot of fun driving this machine and be very successful in it. As always, folks, take care on that battlefield, and I'll catch you next time.